and welcome to this Spectator Education Conference. I think it's the third we've had now. They're becoming part of the scene of the annual education conference calendar. This one's entitled The School's Revolution, Battles Fought and Lessons Learned. So it's very fitting, therefore, that we should have the man at the centre of these battles. And the man, if there are lessons to be learned, is the one who really have to learn them as well. And we're delighted. Michael is always a great supporter of these conferences, and we're very grateful to you for coming along. I think you partly come along because, as I understand it, the editor of the Spectator takes more credit for these education reforms than you do, and he thinks he should be behind them. So you're just coming along, I think, to put him in his place, which is, I think, no bad thing. Editors do need to be put in their place every now and then. I speak as an ex-editor. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before we get into the event. This is the Hoare Memorial Hall, and this is where all the sessions will take place. I think most of you had coffee in the Harvey Goodwin suite, so on the ground floor, and that's where all refreshments and lunch will take place. There's a conference evaluation form at the back of your documentation pack. We'd be very grateful if you could fill that in. We're anxious to learn what we're doing wrong as well as what we think we're doing right. And I'd give a very special thanks this morning to our sponsor, Wilmot Dixon, who build many schools in our country. We're delighted to have their financial support to make this conference possible. So, without further ado, please let me welcome and ask to address our Spectator conference the Secretary of State for Education, Michael Gove.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for your kind words, and can I thank you all for coming along this morning, and for the Spectator for giving me this platform. And Andrew, you're right, I do owe a great deal to the Spectator, and to its current editor, and indeed to you. Because the environment that you've created at the Spectator is in many respects a model of what a good education system should be. Because the Spectator is characterised by a number of virtues that should characterise any good education system. First of all, there's a love of proper English, high-level argument, the best that is currently being thought and the best that is currently being written, all within these pages. The other thing that I particularly admire about the Spectator as a model for our education system is, of course, that it embodies meritocracy. It's a conservative journal, but it has in you and in Fraser lads of peers, figures from backgrounds that one would not normally have thought of as establishment, who've managed to reach the top. There's a proper respect for history, but also in the pages of the Spectator, arts, culture, literature, even sport, all given their place as part of a truly rounded experience. New technology is harnessed in order to make sure that elegance and beauty are introduced to even more through Coffee House and through the other technological innovations that the Spectator has been responsible for. But I think most impressive of all, the Spectator, in a way like any good school, has shown that you can take children from the most difficult backgrounds and you can ensure that they can succeed. And there are two in particular I would think of in the Spectator family. Taki Theodorakopoulos, who came from what one might regard as perhaps the most difficult of backgrounds, Greek plutocracy, and who in the pages of the Spectator has been turned into a civilizing force. And of course Rod Little, who came from an even more difficult environment, working on the BBC Today programme, and whom you've managed to make part of civilization. So in that respect, I'm very, very grateful to the Spectator for showing that you can take children who many others would have written off and make something of them. We're meeting, of course, not just in Church House, but also the day after Margaret Thatcher's funeral. And immediately after Margaret Thatcher's funeral, there was a reception for guests who'd come from abroad to pay their respects to the late Prime Minister. And one of those whom I bumped into was the Polish Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister. He asked me if I could introduce him to our own Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg. And I was very pleased to do so. And as Minister Rostovsky said hello to Nick Clegg, he said, we have something in common. And Nick Clegg, of course, as a keen reader of European politics, said, of course, yes, we're both Deputy Prime Ministers in coalition administrations, and of course we're both committed to stronger European integration. And the Polish Deputy Prime Minister said, no, we were both at Westminster. And Nick Clegg immediately responded, as any British politician would, oh really, which house were you in? And the reason that I mention that story is that it reinforces one of the truths about the English education system. It is admired worldwide, and its influence is global. If you look at our very, very best schools, not just private institutions like Westminster, but our very best state schools as well, and above all our very best universities, then they attract global respect. So there are significant things which we can be proud of in the English education system at the moment. But it would be folly for any education minister to rest on their laurels, and indeed it would be a historic mistake at this time for any education minister to accentuate only the positive in our education system. Because the only way, as any instructor or educator knows, that you can maintain excellence is by striving to do even better, to make sure that the qualities that characterize excellent institutions become more widespread than ever before. And there are two particular reasons why the urgency that I feel behind my back to change and to reform and to improve our education system is greater now than ever before. Greater now than when the coalition government was formed, greater now than when Tony Blair said that his priorities were education, education, education. And there are two particular reasons why, one economic and one moral. The economic first. I think it's still the case that in Britain we are remarkably insular when we think about the relationship between education, the economy, and also the future for our children. We're living at a remarkable moment in world history, an inflection point, where the growth of the developing world looks set to outstrip the expectations of even the most optimistic. If we look beyond Europe, and sometimes it's difficult to do, given the enormous problems that are faced by governments from Portugal to Poland, if we look beyond the European Union, what we can see is dramatic economic growth fueled by one of the biggest population movements in the history of mankind. Growing urbanization from Mexico to East Asia, and in particular, the, in many respects, unnoticed dramatic economic improvements in sub-Saharan Africa, all create a massive increase in the number of individuals entering the middle class, demanding more of their societies, ensuring that their countries become ever more economically competitive. Now, there's a huge opportunity for us here. There are new markets that are being created for our products, new partners in endeavours to make humanity's existence more civilized. But there are also formidable challenges for us. If we look at what else is happening in the European Union and we see Portugal's austerity programme derailed by a politically correct court, or Spain paralysed by the difficulties of attempting to bring a nation together when there are so many different competing interests, or we look at France, where corruption allegations and a lack of political authority mean that their economic revival programme has stalled, then we can at least think to ourselves, well, you know, the situation may be bad, but at least we're doing better than our competitors. But that would be a huge mistake. Because these countries, in a way, are not our principal competitors. These are countries that are facing a crisis which should not and must not overshadow the enormous growth that is happening and will happen elsewhere. And in particular, if we look at what's happening in East Asia, if we look not just at the already acknowledged peaks of success in East Asia, in South Korea, in Singapore and Hong Kong, but if we look more broadly at what is happening in China and in Vietnam, in Indonesia and in the Philippines, we can see millions of people willing to work harder, to strive more energetically, to achieve more in a way that puts us on our, makes a difficult future even more potentially forbidding. And one of the things to stress about the success of all of those countries is that it is driven by not just a sense of ambition, but also a belief that they should mobilize the talents of every child. One of the striking things about East Asian education systems is that they do not have what we have long had in England, which is an automatic assumption that you can divide children at an age, whether it's 5, 11, 16 or whatever, into sheep and goats, into the achievers and the others, the academic and the vocational, the successes and the backmarkers. They believe that every child can be educated, unless they're living with a disability or significantly cognitively impaired. They think that 90% or more of children can succeed, and everything in their education systems is oriented towards proving that. So the assumption is that all children at every year will learn and will absorb everything within the curriculum, and their expectations are higher than in this country. We've been reviewing our curriculum recently, and we've noticed that in Hong Kong, in Singapore, and other East Asian nations, the expectations of mathematical knowledge or of scientific knowledge at every stage are more demanding than in this country. And in order to reach those levels of achievement, a higher level of effort is expected on the part of students, parents, and teachers. School days are longer, school holidays are shorter. The expectation is that to succeed, hard work is at the heart of everything that a young person sees as essential to their character. And if we look at the length of the school day in England, the length of the summer holiday, and we compare it to the extra tuition and support that children are receiving elsewhere, then we're fighting, or I should say running, in this global race in a way which ensures that we already start with a significant handicap. And one of the questions that I think we have to ask ourselves is, if we believe in the civilizing force of education, if we believe that time spent with a gifted teacher is precious in the life of every child, how can we ensure that there is more time for every child in a great classroom, learning more, achieving more, and being ready to take their place in that global race? And one other thing that I would stress as well, that assumption that every child can succeed is a way of ensuring that the excuses which are often made in this country for underachievement don't feature in the debate in those nations. Many of you may be familiar with the Spectator's younger sister, Standpoint magazine. In Standpoint magazine recently, a secondary teacher in Birmingham called Matthew Hunter wrote about his experience in a comprehensive school there. And he made the point that when he was suggesting that a higher level of ambition should be baked into the cake of what happens in that school, he was met with a universal response from many of the other teachers in that school, which was, our kids aren't like that. You don't understand the background from which our kids come, the challenges that our kids face at home, the inappropriateness of thinking about university for our kids. And the point that Matthew Hunter made was that as long as that attitude prevailed, then that statement would become a self-fulfilling prophecy. As long as that poverty of aspiration existed, then children would continue to find themselves taught less well, in an environment where less was expected of them, where they achieved less, and where a cycle of poverty or deprivation continued. And it is only when you generate a level of expectation higher than that, which even the parents themselves might have, that you are capable of liberating children from the circumstances of their birth and providing them with the opportunity to succeed. And that takes me to the moral case for making a change to the education system that we need to do now. Economically, we need to make sure that every pair of hands and every mind is mobilized in order to make sure that our society succeeds economically, because other societies are doing it. But morally, we have a responsibility to improve our education system, because at the moment, there are far too many children and young people who leave school incapable of taking control of their own lives. The responsibility of all those of us charged with leading the education system should be to make sure that when children become adults, they can do what adults should always be capable of doing: exercise autonomy, become authors of their own life story, make decisions for themselves. It's been traditionally a crusading call for the left that individuals should be free from economic circumstances, from the tragedy of birth, that they should be able to be autonomous actors. But actually, the only way that we can achieve that is through the education reform that this government and other radical right governments across the globe have been pursuing. Because it is only when children at the age of 16 or 17 have the range of accomplishments, the qualifications, the confidence that comes from a rigorous, classical, liberal education, that they are then capable of making choices for themselves. And one of the tragedies of what's been called progressive education is the assumption that children from the age of 5 or 6 should be left to discover for themselves the subjects and the enterprises that they enjoy, that they should be left to find out for themselves what's noble or ennobling in literature and in art, that they should be left to discover for themselves what it is during school time hours that motivate them. They can't. They are children. During that period that they are in school, we as adults need to show them what is best in our culture, what is most rigorous and demanding in what has been thought and discovered beforehand. Because it's only if we pass that on to them in school that they will then, as adults, be able to exercise the autonomy and the choice over their lives, which means that they enjoy full dignity and that they can take their place in a modern democratic society. So there are economic and moral reasons why we need to reform education. But if the arguments for why are compelling, then the question of how becomes more important. And what over the last 2.5 years this coalition government has been attempting to do has been to implement on the ground the lessons, not just from history, but from abroad, which tell us what make successful education systems. And we know that there are 3 characteristics that successful education systems have. The first is that they maximise the amount of independence or autonomy that is exercised at school level by head teachers or principals. The second thing is that they make sure that having maximised the amount of freedom that head teachers have, those head teachers are held rigorously and intelligently accountable for what happens in their school or group of schools. And the third thing that international experience tells us is that you need to improve the quality of the instruction that teachers give. You need to recruit better qualified people into the classroom, you need to train them in a better way, and you need to make sure that the process of training consistently drives improvement over time, and that teachers themselves never stop learning. So what have we been doing to try to implement those 3 lessons? Well, the first thing on autonomy. It's now the case that more than half of children in secondary schools are educated in academy schools, schools which are free from central and local government interference, free from what the Department for Education may or may not require and what any future minister may or may not insist be taught, free from local government, cream skimming 5, 10, 15 or 20% of the money which should probably be spent on pupils, but the local council spends it on bureaucracy. Now, the school can reclaim that money and spend it on teaching, spend it on technology, spend it on the child. And the other thing about academies as well is that, of course, freedom is much more than the sum of its parts. And what we've seen amongst academies is a spirit of innovation where the sorts of ideas that are genuinely driving education reform bubble up from the grassroots rather than being imposed from the centre. So if you really want to know what's happening in education now, you shouldn't listen to any politician, you should visit those schools where those freedoms are being deployed most energetically and imaginatively. So if you were to go to King Solomon Academy, one of the art academies in Lisson Grove, one of the poorest parts of Westminster, you would see ways of teaching children, introducing them to maths every bit as demanding as the mathematics that's taught in Singapore, ways of introducing them to literature which are designed explicitly to make students think of themselves as on track to college, whatever their background. Interactions between adults and children, where children learn about self-respect and self-discipline, which are inspiring, but driven by the fact that they were created by teachers, not designed by bureaucrats. So that's what autonomy has meant, the empowering of teachers to shape what's happening in education. But of course that autonomy has to be matched by rigorous accountability. And that's why we've ensured that the inspection of our schools becomes sharper than ever before. It's why we've appointed Sir Michael Wilshaw, an outstanding head teacher who's devoted his entire life to working in the state sector, to making sure that inspection increasingly focuses on the quality of teaching and leadership, and that the sorts of things, politically correct baggage that we had to inspect for in the past, community cohesion, all that sort of nonsense, that is entirely subordinated to making sure that children are learning. And it's also the case that, as well as inspection, we're being more rigorous about the way in which children are examined and tested. And that's meant that we've had to reform GCSEs. It's meant that we've taken steps to ensure that the examinations at the end of primary school are changed so that children are guaranteed to be secure in English by knowing how to spell, punctuate, and construct a grammatically a proper sentence. And these changes are designed not just to ensure that children can be secure before they move to the next stage of education, they're also designed to ensure that schools can be held to account for improving the lives of children. And increasingly, we've changed the focus of accountability not just onto the raw level of performance of every child, but how much difference each school makes. How has the life of every child been transformed? How has performance improved? But the most critical thing is not so much the autonomy or the accountability, it's the human factor. It's making sure that we can attract more great people into teaching. And one of the, I think, most heartening things about education at the moment is that there has never been a better time to be a teacher. The public esteem in which teachers are held has never been higher. Recent survey work by the teaching agency, the body responsible for recruiting teachers, showed that the view of the public towards a relative who said that they were going to go into teaching was higher than ever before. The respect which accrues to the profession, greater. And I think that's because a genuine change has been occurring in our classrooms. We have a generation of young people who've been entering teaching now for several years, who are significantly more intellectually accomplished than any generation ever before teaching in our classrooms. And that trend is accelerating and improving. In the last year for which we have figures, the number of students applying to teach in mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology and English who have a 2-1 degree or better has been higher than ever before. Now some of you cynics, and I know that the Spectator doesn't entertain cynicism, may say yes, but that's because of great inflation and higher education. Well, whatever the truth about improved performance in higher education, the proportion of students with those top degrees entering teaching has grown far faster than the proportion of students getting better degrees overall. And it's also the case that there are other institutions like Teach First, a charitable organisation, which explicitly targets students from the very best universities with the very best degrees and gets them into teaching, which is transforming things. Now, simply having a good degree doesn't make you a great teacher. But on the whole, I think you will agree that if you're going to spend your time communicating a love of subject to the next generation, and if you're going to cultivate the life of the mind, then being smart, loving learning, and doing well yourself academically are 3 fantastic credentials to take into the classroom. The other thing that we're doing is we're also making sure that increasingly teacher training doesn't take place in higher education institutions alone, that their monopoly or near monopoly over the training of teachers ends, and increasingly teachers learn the craft of teaching in the classroom in the very, very best schools. And one of the ways of doing that is by empowering schools themselves to take control of teacher training and to be the centres of innovation and excellence in teaching research and in the development of new pedagogies. And I think this is a significant and again underappreciated change. In the past, the education debate has to a significant extent been dominated by education academics in departments of education. And they have actually, in many cases, often been the weakest link in the academic chain in those universities. The quality of their research, the academic rigour of the work that they have done hasn't often stood comparison with their peers at universities. But what has been striking is the way in which the very, very best schools have, in the practice that they employ every day, shown those academics what genuine breakthroughs in how to teach and how to inspire young people should look like. And I want to build on the success of those schools by acknowledging that it's within those schools and groups of schools that the genuine breakthroughs in how we teach should be made. That's why we've endowed the Educational Endowment Foundation, which is there to help support academic research in schools into what works. It's why we've collaborated with Dr. Ben Goldacre, the author of Bad Science, in order to make sure that we can run randomized control trials in schools into what is working in our schools, because we want practice on the ground to be driven by evidence rather than by the assertions of ideologues in ivory towers. And one of the things that's helped us enormously in that has been the growth on the ground of teachers committed to improving their practice and taking advantage of these reforms. And that brings me to my final point. There have been education reformers in the past in this country, And sometimes it's been the case that just as they feel that they've been about to make a significant move forward, they've been cut down, or the momentum has been checked. So, for example, the Great Education Reform Bill that was introduced by Kenneth Baker could have unleashed a great wave of momentous reform, and it did make some significant changes which were all to the good. But in the early 90s, for a variety of reasons, the reform momentum foundered, with government and unions at loggerheads and an introspective debate within the Conservative Party. Then, of course, with Tony Blair and the embrace of change in the Education White Paper of 2005 and the Education Bill of 2006, there was another opportunity for significant acceleration of reform. But again, for internal party reasons, he was cut down, that opportunity was lost. Now, thanks to David Cameron's leadership, thanks indeed to the support of Nick Clegg and David Laws across the coalition, we've made some significant strides. But an inevitable question might be, what would happen if the replacement government to this coalition government wasn't committed to reform, wasn't seized of the economic and moral importance of change? Could what we've achieved so far be washed away like a child's sandcastle in the face of an incoming tide? Is it the case that whatever we've achieved might seem to be like Cromwell's interregnum? A change which seems significant, but which, once you get a restoration of a previously ejected regime, can be swept away? Well, I think that all vanity aside, the real change that's been happening in our education system, as I hope I've been made clear, has been driven by teachers. And for that reason, the change that we have made is one where we've facilitated reform on the ground, which I think will be enduring. I don't think anyone now would want to close down the free schools that have been created. I don't think anyone now would say that Toby Young's West London Free School, or the group of free schools which are run by Patricia Souter in North West London, or the Greenwich Free School, which is providing a high-quality education in a part of South East London that's been deprived, should be closed. It would be, I think, an act of madness on the part of any future government to say that these excellent institutions should be closed, and they're no more likely to close than the grammar schools were going to be closed when Tony Blair came to power in 1997. In the same way, when more than half of secondary schools are academies, and it's been the decision of individual head teachers to make the schools academies, when teachers in academies are better paid than teachers outside, I don't think that we will see an erosion of their autonomy or independence, or a reversion to the situation that we had before. When the spell of the education establishment in education faculties and higher education institutions has been broken, because academics from outside, like Ben Goldacre, and teachers on the ground have proved that those academics know less about how to improve children's lives than practitioners who are in the classroom every day, then I don't think we'll go back to believing that university faculties of education and the academics within them are the people who can transform our children's lives for the better. When we've set the bar higher through a national curriculum and examinations, which are genuinely rigorous, and we stop lying to children about the level of achievement that they've had, then I think that the prospect of us slipping back into deception and moving away from truth-telling has gone. And I also think when the powers in the land that control money in our education system are no longer the local authorities that misallocated it and spent it on bureaucratic follies, but increasingly groups of schools like ARC, like Harris, like the Perry Beaches group of schools in Birmingham, like the group of schools in East Manchester being led by Donna Ross-Wrosinski. When we see the changes that head teachers like Barry Day leading Greenwood Dale, or Mike Wilkins at Outwood Grange have wrought amongst groups of schools, the chains, the federations that they have created, I think increasingly, rather than asking the question, how is Lancashire doing? How is Brent doing? People will be asking the question, how are Greenwood Dale doing? How are Harris doing? And the question will be, in a spirit of rivalrous emulation, what can each learn from each? So I think that the changes that we've wrought are there for good. Not because of the political will of people in the coalition, though it's strong. Not because of the determination of ministers in the Department for Education to promote change, though that's unwavering. But because what we've done is to empower those in our education system, teachers, who who've been driven by a sense of moral purpose to embrace a programme of change which transforms children's lives. Thank you all very much. Thank you.